The silence had been eating at Eleanor Dixon for 3 months straight, ever since the day she watched her father's coffin lowered into the hard Nevada ground. And the only thing worse than the quiet was the way people in McGill kept talking at her like she was made of glass about to shatter. She stood on the porch of her father's ranch, which was now her ranch though she could barely comprehend that fact, and watched the dust devils dance across the barren landscape, as the summer heat of 1882 beat down mercilessly on everything beneath the endless sky. The cattle needed moving to better grazing land before they starved. The fence posts on the eastern boundary were rotting through, and she had exactly $47 to her name and 3 hired hands who looked at her every morning like they expected her to announce she was selling and heading back east to whatever family she had left, which was nobody at all. Her father had built this place from nothing over 20 years, carving out a life in the high desert of eastern Nevada, where most men would have given up after the first brutal winter. Eleanor had been born here, raised here, and knew every inch of the 1,200 acres like she knew her own heartbeat. But knowing the land and running it were 2 different things entirely, and the men who worked the ranch knew it as well as she did. They were good men, loyal to her father's memory, but she could see the doubt creeping into their eyes when she gave orders, could feel them hesitating before they followed through. The worst part was the loneliness that came with being a woman in charge. The other ranchers in the area had offered their condolences but nothing more, and she knew what they were thinking even if they were too polite to say it outright. A 22-year-old woman had no business trying to run a cattle operation, and they were just waiting for her to fail so they could buy up the land for cheap. Her father had taught her everything, had treated her like the son he never had. But that did not matter to men who believed a woman's place was in a kitchen or a schoolhouse, not on horseback counting heads and making decisions about breeding stock and water rights. She heard the hoofbeats before she saw the rider, and shaded her eyes against the glare to make out a lone figure approaching from the direction of town. As he got closer, she recognized him as the new hand her foreman had hired 2 weeks back, though calling him new was almost funny considering she barely knew the first thing about him. His name was Marcus Miller, and he had ridden in looking for work with nothing but a bedroll, a horse that had seen better days, and a recommendation letter from a ranch down in Arizona that her foreman had checked out and found legitimate. What made Marcus Miller different from every other ranch hand she had ever encountered was his absolute and complete silence. In the 14 days he had been working the Dixon ranch, Eleanor could count on one hand the number of words she had heard him speak. When her foreman had hired him and introduced them, Marcus had touched the brim of his hat and said, "Madam." When she had asked him the next morning if he knew how to handle the ornery roan gelding that had been giving them trouble, he had nodded once and said, "Yes." That was the extent of their conversation, and from what she had gathered talking to the other hands, Marcus did not speak much more to them either. He was a good worker, though. Nobody could deny that. He was up before dawn every morning and worked until well past sunset, never complaining, never asking for anything extra. He was maybe 25 or 26 from what she could tell, tall and lean with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes that were an unusual shade of gray-green. He had a way with the horses that bordered on uncanny, and she had watched him calm a spooked mare in half the time it would have taken anyone else, using nothing but his hands and some wordless communication that seemed to flow between him and the animal. Marcus dismounted near the barn and led his horse inside, and Eleanor turned back to stare at the account books she had spread across her father's desk in the small office off the main room of the ranch house. The numbers did not look any better now than they had an hour ago. She needed to hire at least 2 more men before the fall roundup, but she could not afford to pay them. She needed to replace the pump on the north well, but the equipment would cost nearly $30. She needed a miracle, but those seemed to be in short supply in McGill, Nevada. The sound of breaking glass made her jump, and she rushed outside to see one of the hands, a red-haired hothead named Tommy, squaring off against Marcus near the water trough. Tommy's face was flushed with anger, and there were shards of a whiskey bottle scattered across the dirt at his feet. The other 2 hands were standing nearby, watching with the wary expressions of men who wanted no part of whatever was about to happen. "You think you're better than us?" Tommy was shouting, his fists clenched at his sides. "Walking around here like you're God's gift, not saying a damn word to nobody. You think that makes you special?" Marcus stood perfectly still, his expression unreadable. He did not rise to the bait, did not even seem particularly interested in the confrontation. That just seemed to make Tommy angrier. "I'm talking to you." Tommy took a step forward, and Eleanor saw her foreman, a grizzled veteran named Pete Harrison, start moving toward them from the barn. "You gonna say something, or are you just gonna stand there like a damn mute?" Eleanor did not think, just acted. She stepped off the porch and walked straight toward the 2 men, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "That's enough. Tommy, you're drunk and you're fired. Get your things and get off my property." Tommy spun to face her, his eyes wild. "You can't fire me. Your daddy hired me 4 years ago, and I've been loyal to this place longer than you've been running it, which is about 5 minutes. My father isn't here anymore, and I just fired you," Eleanor said, keeping her voice level even though her heart was hammering in her chest. "You've got 1 hour to clear out, or Pete will escort you to town personally." For a moment she thought Tommy might actually take a swing at her, and she saw Marcus shift slightly in her peripheral vision, his body language changing in a way that suggested he was ready to intervene if necessary. But Pete had reached them now, and the older man put a hand on Tommy's shoulder with enough pressure to make the younger man wince. "You heard the lady," Pete said quietly. "Go sleep it off somewhere else." Tommy jerked away from Pete's grip and spat in the dirt at Eleanor's feet before stalking off toward the bunkhouse. Eleanor felt her hands shaking and clasped them behind her back so no one would see. She had just fired one of her few ranch hands when she could not afford to hire replacements, and all because the man had been drinking and picking a fight. Her father would have handled it differently, would have found a way to defuse the situation without losing a worker, but she was not her father. "You did the right thing," Pete said, as if reading her mind. "Man like that is poison in a bunkhouse. Better to cut him loose now before he causes real trouble." Eleanor nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She glanced at Marcus, who had already turned away and was walking back toward the barn as if nothing had happened. The man was like smoke, there one moment and gone the next, leaving no trace of himself behind. The next few days passed in a blur of work and worry. Tommy had left without further incident, taking his gear and riding out in the middle of the night like a thief. Eleanor threw herself into the ranch work, rising even earlier than usual and pushing herself until her muscles ached, and her mind was too tired to dwell on all the ways she was failing to live up to her father's legacy. She moved cattle, mended fence, helped Pete shoe horses, and did everything she could to prove to her remaining hands that she was serious about making this work. Marcus continued his pattern of silence, speaking only when absolutely necessary, and even then using as few words as possible. Eleanor found herself watching him sometimes when she thought he was not paying attention, trying to puzzle out what made a man so determined to keep himself separate from everyone around him. He ate his meals alone, never joined the other hands when they played cards in the evening, and spent his free time either with the horses or simply sitting on the corral fence staring out at the desert, like he was looking for something he had lost a long time ago. She was in the barn late one evening, checking on a mare that was due to foal any day, when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Marcus standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands. They looked at each other for a long moment, and Eleanor waited for him to speak, but he just nodded toward the mare and then disappeared back into the gathering darkness. The foal came 3 nights later, and it was Eleanor who found the mare in distress. The birth was not going right, and the mare was thrashing and wild-eyed with pain and fear. Eleanor sent one of the hands for Pete, but the foreman had ridden into town that afternoon and was not expected back until morning. The other hand, a kid named Billy who was barely 18, turned pale when he saw the situation and admitted he had never dealt with a difficult birth before. Eleanor had helped her father with foaling more times than she could count, but never one like this. She could see immediately that the foal was positioned wrong, and if she did not do something fast, she was going to lose both the mare and the baby. Her mind raced through the options, but her hands were too small, and she did not have the strength to manipulate the foal into the right position on her own. She was elbow-deep in blood and amniotic fluid, tears of frustration streaming down her face when Marcus appeared in the barn. He took one look at the situation, handed his hat to Billy, and rolled up his sleeves. Eleanor started to explain what was wrong, but Marcus just nodded and moved to the mare's head, placing his hands on either side of her face and making a low, soothing sound deep in his throat. The mare calmed immediately, her rolling eyes steadying as she focused on Marcus. Eleanor had never seen anything like it. The animal was clearly still in pain, but the panic had left her, replaced by something that looked almost like trust. Marcus kept up the wordless crooning while Eleanor worked, and together they managed to reposition the foal and guide it into the world. When it was finally over, and the exhausted mare was nuzzling her newborn son, Eleanor collapsed back against the stall wall and felt the adrenaline drain out of her all at once. Her arms were shaking, and she was covered in blood and worse, and she was crying again, though she could not have said if it was from relief or exhaustion or the overwhelming weight of everything she was carrying. She felt Marcus sit down beside her in the hay, keeping a respectful distance but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool night air. They sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the mare's gentle whickering and the wet sounds of the foal trying to stand on trembling legs. "Thank you," Eleanor finally managed to say, her voice hoarse. "I could not have done that without you." Marcus did not respond, and she had not really expected him to. But then, to her complete surprise, he started speaking, his voice low and rusty sounding, like a door that had not been opened in a very long time. "Lost my wife in childbirth 2 years back," he said, staring straight ahead at the mare and foal. "Her and the baby both. Was working a ranch outside Tucson then. I was out moving cattle when it started, and by the time I got back to the house, there was nothing the doctor could do. She bled to death while I stood there watching, holding her hand and not able to do a damn thing to help her." Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat. She turned to look at him, but Marcus was still focused on the horses, his profile carved in shadow and lamplight. "Her name was Sarah," he continued. "We'd been married 3 years, and every single one of those days I talked her ear off. I always had something to say, some story to tell, always filling up the silence with words. After she died, I realized that I'd wasted all that time talking when I should have been listening. So I stopped. Figured if I couldn't say something that mattered, something that really meant something, then there was no point in saying anything at all." He paused, and Eleanor saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. "But sitting here, watching you save that mare and her foal, doing everything in your power to make sure they both lived even though you were scared and exhausted and probably wondering if you could actually do it. I figured maybe this was one of those times when words might matter. You did good tonight, Eleanor. Your father would have been proud." Then he stood up, dusted off his pants, and walked out of the barn before Eleanor could find her voice to respond. She sat there in the hay for a long time after he left, her heart pounding, and her mind reeling from the flood of words Marcus Miller had just poured out like water from a broken dam. He had spoken more in those few minutes than in the entire 2 weeks since he had arrived, and every word had been like a gift she had not known she needed. She thought about Sarah, about the pain of losing someone you loved, about the way grief could change a person so fundamentally that they became someone new entirely. She thought about her own father, about the silence that had consumed her after his death, different from Marcus's silence, but just as heavy and suffocating. And she thought about the way Marcus had looked at her when he said her father would have been proud, like he really meant it, like he could see something in her that she was not sure she could see in herself. The next morning, Eleanor woke with a sense of purpose she had not felt in months. The mare and foal were both doing well, and she spent an extra hour in the barn with them, watching the baby learn to nurse and feeling something like hope stirring in her chest. When she finally headed to the house for breakfast, she found Pete waiting for her with news that the bank in town wanted to see her as soon as possible. The ride into McGill took 40 minutes, and Eleanor spent the entire time trying not to imagine all the terrible reasons the bank might be calling her in. Her father had taken out a loan 3 years ago to expand the herd, and she had been making the payments on time every month, but maybe they had decided a woman could not be trusted to manage the debt. Maybe they were going to call in the full amount and force her to sell. By the time she tied her horse outside the bank, she had worked herself into a state of near panic. The banker, a pompous man named Cyrus Whitmore who had never liked her father, kept her waiting for 20 minutes before deigning to see her. When she was finally ushered into his office, he did not offer her a seat, just looked at her over his spectacles like she was a particularly troublesome insect. "Miss Dixon," he said, managing to make her name sound like an insult. "I'll be direct. The loan your father took out has 6 months remaining on it, at which point the principal and remaining interest will be due in full. That amounts to $473. Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. "The agreement was that I could continue making monthly payments until the loan was satisfied. I have the paperwork at home." "The agreement was made with your father, who is unfortunately deceased," Whitmore said, folding his hands on his desk. "The bank has reviewed the situation and determined that the risk of continuing the loan under current management is too high. We require full payment in 6 months, or we will be forced to foreclose and auction the property to satisfy the debt." "That's not legal," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with anger. "You cannot just change the terms because my father died. I assure you, Miss Dixon, it is entirely legal. The contract includes a clause allowing the bank to call in the loan if there is a significant change in circumstances. Your father's death and your assumption of control constitute such a change." He gave her a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. "Of course, if you were to marry, and your husband were willing to assume responsibility for the loan and the ranch, we would be happy to continue the original payment schedule." Eleanor wanted to throw something at him, wanted to scream that she was just as capable of running the ranch as any man, but she knew it would do no good. Men like Cyrus Whitmore had made up their minds about women a long time ago, and nothing she said or did was going to change that. She turned and walked out of his office with her head held high, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She made it halfway down the main street before the tears started, and she ducked into the alley between the general store and the saloon to compose herself. $473 in 6 months. She would need to sell half the herd to raise that kind of money, which would leave her with no breeding stock and no way to rebuild. Or she could try to find a buyer for the whole ranch, but that would mean giving up everything her father had worked for, everything she had poured her heart and soul into. She was crying in earnest now, harsh sobs that shook her whole body, and she pressed her hands over her mouth to muffle the sound. She felt like she was drowning, like the weight of it all was finally going to pull her under, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Eleanor. She jerked her head up to find Marcus standing at the mouth of the alley, his horse's reins in his hand. He must have ridden into town for supplies, though she had not seen him when she passed the general store. He was looking at her with an expression she could not quite read, something between concern and understanding and a deep, abiding sadness that seemed to mirror her own. "I'm fine," she started to say, but her voice broke on the words and another sob escaped her throat. She turned away from him, embarrassed to be seen like this, to be so utterly falling apart. She heard his footsteps, heard him tie his horse to a post, and then he was there beside her. Not touching her, not crowding her space, just standing close enough that she knew she was not alone. "The bank is calling in my father's loan," she heard herself say, the words tumbling out in a rush. "They want $473 in 6 months, or they're taking the ranch. They said if I got married, they would honor the original agreement, but I don't have anyone to marry, and even if I did, I wouldn't want it to be like that. Like I needed to be rescued by some man who would probably just take over and push me aside anyway. And I know I'm not doing a good job. I know I'm making mistakes, but I'm trying so hard, and it's like no matter what I do, it's not enough. Nothing I do is ever enough." She was rambling now, saying things she had not said to anyone, not even to herself in the dark hours of the night when the fear was at its worst. And Marcus just stood there and listened, his presence solid and steady beside her, and somehow that made it easier to let it all out. "Your father told me once that this land had a way of breaking people," Marcus said quietly when she finally ran out of words. "He said the only ones who survived were the ones too stubborn to know when they were beaten. You've got that stubbornness, Eleanor. I've seen it in the way you work, the way you push yourself harder than any of those men would ever push themselves. You're not failing. You're fighting, and that's what matters." Eleanor wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked at him. "How do you fight a bank? How do you fight men who have already decided you're going to fail?" "You find another way," Marcus said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he took a deep breath and continued. "I've got money saved. Not a lot, but enough. I could lend you what you need to pay off the bank." Eleanor stared at him in shock. "I can't take your money, that's not. You barely know me." "I know enough," Marcus said. "I know you're the kind of person who stays up all night with a mare in trouble. I know you fired a man for being drunk and disrespectful, even though you could not afford to lose him. I know you loved your father and you're trying to honor his memory by keeping this place going. That's more than enough." "Why would you do this?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you help me?" Marcus looked away, his jaw working. "Because Sarah would have done the same thing if she'd seen someone who needed help. She had a good heart, always looking out for people who were struggling. And because I've spent the last 2 years trying to figure out what I'm supposed to do with the rest of my life, and maybe this is it. Maybe this is how I start making things right." Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, some piece of armor she had been wearing sliding away to reveal the raw vulnerability beneath. "I don't know when I could pay you back," It might take years. I'm not worried about it, Marcus said. He finally looked at her again, and there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch. You'll pay me back when you can. Until then, we keep the ranch running and we prove to all those men who are waiting for you to fail that they don't know a damn thing about Eleanor Dixon. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him it was too much, that she could not accept such a huge debt, but the truth was she needed help, and he was offering it freely, without conditions or expectations. And there was something else too, something she was not quite ready to name, a feeling that had been growing in the weeks since Marcus arrived and that had crystallized in the barn when he had sat beside her and shared the story of his loss. Okay, she said finally. Okay, thank you. Marcus nodded once, that economical gesture she had come to associate with him. We should get back. That foal is going to need checking on. They rode back to the ranch side by side, not talking but somehow more comfortable in the silence than Eleanor had ever been with anyone else. The afternoon sun beat down on them, and the endless Nevada sky stretched overhead. And for the first time since her father's death, Eleanor felt like maybe she was not in this alone. Over the next weeks, something shifted in the dynamic of the ranch. Marcus paid off the bank loan with money he had been keeping in an account in Arizona, and Eleanor watched Cyrus Whitmore's face turn purple with frustration when she walked into his office with the full payment. The banker had no choice but to mark the loan as satisfied and hand over the deed free and clear, and Eleanor walked out of that building feeling 10 feet tall. But the money had not solved all her problems, just bought her time to address them. She still needed more hands for the fall roundup, still needed to fix the well and replace the fence posts, and a dozen other things that required resources she did not have. Marcus had become her unofficial partner in running the ranch, though they had never discussed it formally. He just started appearing at her side when she was making decisions, offering quiet observations that helped her see things from a different angle. He spoke more now, though never wastefully. Every word still seemed to be carefully considered before it left his mouth, but he had conversations with her in the evenings when the work was done, sitting on the porch and watching the stars come out. He told her about Arizona, about the ranch where he had worked with Sarah, about the life they had been building before it was cut short. Eleanor told him about growing up with her father, about her mother who had died when Eleanor was just 6, about the loneliness of being the only girl in a world of men who did not quite know what to make of her. She learned that Marcus had grown up in Texas, that he had been breaking horses since he was 14, that he had a way with animals because he understood what it was like to be hurt and scared and just needed someone to be patient. She learned that he read books when he could get his hands on them, that his favorite was a collection of Walt Whitman poems Sarah had given him for their first anniversary, that he carried it in his saddlebag, and sometimes read from it when he thought no one was watching. And Marcus learned about Eleanor's dreams for the ranch, about her plans to breed better quality horses, about her belief that there was a market for well-trained mounts if she could just get the operation established. He listened to her ideas and did not dismiss them as foolish or impractical the way other men had. Instead, he asked questions, pointed out potential challenges, and helped her refine her plans until they started to feel achievable. Pete noticed the change, and Eleanor caught him watching her and Marcus with a knowing look that made her blush. But the old foreman did not say anything, just went about his business with a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The other hands had accepted Marcus fully now, even if they still thought he was strange for being so quiet. They had seen him work, had seen him gentle a half-wild Mustang in the space of an afternoon, and that was enough to earn their respect. The heat of summer gave way to the slightly cooler days of early fall, and the work intensified as they prepared for the roundup. They brought in 2 temporary hands from town, cowboys who were willing to work for wages and a share of the sale money. Eleanor spent long days in the saddle, helping to gather cattle from the far reaches of the ranch, and fell into bed each night so exhausted she barely had time to think before sleep claimed her. It was on one of those long days that the accident happened. They were moving a group of steers through a rocky canyon when one of the animals spooked and bolted. Marcus went after it on instinct, his horse picking its way through the treacherous terrain at a speed that made Eleanor's heart leap into her throat. She saw the moment when the horse's hoof slipped on loose shale, saw Marcus try to compensate, and then watched in horror as both horse and rider went down hard. She was off her own mount and running before she even realized she had moved, scrambling over rocks with Pete right behind her. Marcus was already sitting up by the time she reached him, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead and his left arm cradled against his chest. The horse had rolled clear and was standing a few feet away, favoring its right front leg but otherwise appearing uninjured. "Don't move," Eleanor said, dropping to her knees beside him. "You might have broken something." "I'm fine," Marcus said, but his face was white with pain and his voice was strained. "Just knocked the wind out of me." Pete arrived and made a quick assessment. "That arm's broken. We need to get you back to the house and send for the doctor." The ride back to the ranch was an exercise in controlled terror for Eleanor. Marcus sat his horse with gritted teeth, his broken arm held tight against his body, and she could see the pain in every line of his face even though he did not make a sound. When they finally reached the house, she helped him down and into the kitchen, settling him in a chair while Pete sent one of the hands galloping into town for the doctor. The doctor, a tired-looking man named Samuel Pierce, who had been practicing in McGill for 15 years, confirmed that Marcus's arm was broken in 2 places and needed to be set and splinted. Eleanor held Marcus's good hand while the doctor worked, feeling his fingers tighten around hers in a grip that was just short of painful. He made no sound except for a sharp intake of breath when the bone slid back into place, and Eleanor felt tears burning in her eyes at the sight of his suffering. When it was finally over, and Marcus was resting on the couch in the parlor with his arm properly splinted and enough laudanum in him to dull the worst of the pain, Eleanor sat beside him and tried to keep her hands from shaking. She had been so scared, watching him fall, convinced for a terrible moment that she was about to lose another person she cared about. And she did care about him, she realized. Somewhere in the last months, Marcus Miller had become more than just a ranch hand or even a friend. He had become someone she looked for first thing in the morning and last thing at night. Someone whose quiet presence made her feel safe and understood in ways she had not felt since her father died. The thought of losing him had been like a knife to the heart, and now, sitting beside him as he drifted in and out of consciousness, she could not avoid the truth anymore. She was falling in love with him. The realization should have scared her, but instead it filled her with a kind of fierce certainty. She did not know if Marcus felt the same way, did not know if he was ready to open his heart again after losing Sarah. But she knew what she felt, and for now, that was enough. Marcus was forced to rest for the next 2 weeks while his arm healed, and Eleanor could see the frustration eating at him. He was not a man who was comfortable being idle and being relegated to light duties around the barn while the others continued with the roundup, clearly grated on him. But he followed the doctor's orders, and Eleanor made sure he did not push himself too hard, checking on him multiple times a day with a concern that she suspected was not entirely professional. They fell into a pattern during those weeks. Eleanor would finish her work for the day and find Marcus in the barn or on the porch, and they would sit together while the evening settled around them. They talked more than they ever had before, the conversations flowing easier now that some barrier between them had dissolved. Marcus told her about his childhood in Texas, about a father who drank too much and a mother who had done her best to hold the family together. Eleanor told him about the years after her mother died, about stepping into the role of woman of the house at 6 years old and learning to cook and clean while still learning to read and write. One evening, about 10 days into his recovery, Marcus said something that made Eleanor's heart skip a beat. They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, and he turned to her with an expression that was both hopeful and terrified. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about the future. About what comes next." Eleanor waited, hardly daring to breathe. "When I came here, I was just looking for a place to work, somewhere to disappear for a while and figure things out," Marcus continued. "I wasn't expecting to find you. This ranch and the life you're building and the way you fight for what you believe in even when everyone's telling you you can't have it." He paused, and Eleanor could see him gathering his courage for whatever came next. "I know it hasn't been that long, and I know you probably have other plans for your life, but I want you to know that if you ever wanted a partner in this, someone to help you build this ranch into everything you dream it can be, I'd be honored to be that person. In whatever way you'd have me." Eleanor felt tears spilling down her cheeks, but these were not tears of sadness or frustration. These were tears of joy, of relief, of a happiness so profound it felt like it might consume her entirely. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" she said, her voice shaking. Marcus met her eyes steadily. "I'm saying I love you, Eleanor Dixon. I'm saying that somewhere along the way, you became the reason I get up in the morning and the last thing I think about before I fall asleep. I'm saying that, if you feel even a fraction of what I feel, I'd like to spend the rest of my life proving to you that you made the right choice in letting me stay." Eleanor did not trust herself to speak, so instead she leaned forward and kissed him. It was gentle and tentative at first, both of them learning the shape and feel of each other, but it deepened quickly into something that felt like coming home. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Marcus was smiling in a way she had never seen before, open and unguarded and so beautiful it made her heart ache. "I love you too," she said, the words feeling both momentous and entirely natural. "I think I've been falling in love with you since that night in the barn when you told me about Sarah and made me feel like maybe I wasn't crazy for wanting to keep fighting." "You're not crazy," Marcus said, reaching up to cup her face with his good hand. "You're the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever met, and I don't have the words to tell you how grateful I am that you let me into your life." They sat there on the porch holding each other as the stars came out overhead, and Eleanor felt a sense of peace she had not known in longer than she could remember. There would still be challenges ahead, still obstacles to overcome and battles to fight, but she would not be facing them alone anymore. She had Marcus, and that changed everything. They were married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in McGill, with Pete serving as Marcus's best man and the wife of the general store owner standing up for Eleanor. It was nothing fancy, just a handful of friends and ranch hands gathered to witness their vows, but it was perfect. Eleanor wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in a trunk for all these years, and Marcus wore his best shirt and a new vest he had bought special for the occasion. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Marcus kissed Eleanor with a tenderness that made her forget everyone else in the room. This was their moment, their beginning, and nothing else mattered except the promise they had just made to each other. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and food provided by half the town. People who had barely spoken to Eleanor since her father's death suddenly wanted to congratulate her and wish her well. and she suspected that Marcus's presence made her somehow more acceptable in their eyes. She tried not to let that bother her, tried to just enjoy the celebration, but Marcus seemed to sense her irritation and pulled her away for a dance. They swayed together to the music of a fiddle player Pete had brought in from town, and Marcus held her close and whispered in her ear, "They don't matter. Their opinions don't matter. The only thing that matters is that we know what we're building here, and we know what we mean to each other." Eleanor smiled and rested her head on his shoulder. "When did you get so wise?" "I had a good teacher," Marcus said. "She taught me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is keep going even when you're scared, even when everyone is telling you you're going to fail. She taught me that love is worth fighting for, and that home isn't a place. It's the people you choose to stand beside." They danced until the stars came out, and when the guests finally left and it was just the two of them in the ranch house that was now truly theirs, Marcus carried Eleanor over the threshold and up the stairs to the bedroom they would share. They made love for the first time as husband and wife with a sweetness and passion that left them both breathless, and afterward they lay tangled together in the sheets, talking quietly about their dreams for the future. "I want to have children," Eleanor said, tracing patterns on Marcus's chest. "I want this house to be filled with laughter and noise and all the chaos that comes with a family." "I want that too," Marcus said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I want to build something lasting here, something we can pass down to our children and our children's children. I want to prove that two people who found each other when they needed it most can create something beautiful." They fell asleep in each other's arms, and for the first time in months, Eleanor did not dream of her father or the bank or all the ways she might fail. She dreamed, instead of a future filled with possibility, of children running through the ranch yard, of growing old beside the man she loved. The next year brought challenges and triumphs in equal measure. The spring roundup was successful, and they were able to sell enough cattle to put money back into the ranch for improvements. Marcus's skill with horses attracted attention, and they started getting requests from neighboring ranches to train their problem animals. What started as a side business grew quickly, and within months they had a steady stream of horses coming through the ranch. Eleanor discovered she was pregnant in late summer, and the joy on Marcus's face when she told him made her cry happy tears. He was attentive and protective throughout her pregnancy, sometimes to the point of being overbearing, but she loved him for it. He had lost one wife and child in childbirth, and she knew his fear was born of that terrible memory. When her time came the following spring, it was a long and difficult labor that lasted nearly 24 hours. Marcus stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and whispering encouragement even when she screamed and cursed him for putting her through this. The midwife they had brought in from the nearest big town was calm and competent, and when their son finally entered the world with a lusty cry, Marcus wept openly with relief and joy. They named him Matthew, after Marcus's middle name, and he was perfect in every way. Eleanor had never known it was possible to love someone as immediately and completely as she loved her son, and watching Marcus hold the baby with such tender care made her fall in love with her husband all over again. Life settled into a new rhythm after Matthew's birth. Eleanor learned to balance motherhood with ranch management, often conducting business with the baby strapped to her chest in a sling Marcus had fashioned from soft leather. The men who had once doubted her ability to run the ranch were won over by the undeniable success of the operation, and by the fierce protectiveness of Marcus, who made it clear that anyone who disrespected his wife would answer to him. The horse training business continued to grow, and they hired 2 additional hands specifically to help with that side of the operation. Marcus had a gift for teaching, and he passed his techniques on to the new men with the same patience he showed the animals. Eleanor watched him work and marveled at how far he had come from the silent, haunted man who had ridden onto her ranch all those months ago. They still had their evening ritual of sitting on the porch together, though now Matthew was usually asleep in Eleanor's arms or playing at their feet. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing the small details of their days and making plans for the future. Marcus still chose his words carefully, but he spoke freely with Eleanor in a way he did not with anyone else, and she treasured every conversation. 2 years after Matthew was born, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter they named Emma, after Eleanor's middle name. The delivery was easier this time, and Marcus was less anxious, though he still hovered until the midwife threatened to throw him out of the room. Emma had Eleanor's dark hair and Marcus's gray-green eyes, and she was a calm, contemplative baby who seemed content to watch the world around her with serious attention. The ranch continued to prosper. The cattle operation remained steady, providing a reliable income, but it was the horse training that really took off. Marcus's reputation spread throughout Nevada and into neighboring states, and they had a waiting list of clients wanting their horses worked. They expanded the operation, building additional corrals and a larger barn, and hired more hands to manage the increased workload. Eleanor proved to be a savvy businesswoman, negotiating contracts and managing the finances with a skill that impressed even the men who had once tried to force her out. She kept meticulous records, reinvested profits wisely, and slowly but surely built the Dixon Ranch into one of the most successful operations in eastern Nevada. But success did not change who they were at their core. Eleanor still worked alongside her hands when needed, still knew every inch of the ranch as intimately as she had when her father was alive. Marcus still rose before dawn and worked until sunset, still treated every horse with the gentle respect that had become his trademark. They were partners in every sense of the word, building their life together with the same determination and grit that had brought them through those early difficult months. When Matthew was 5 and Emma was 3, Eleanor became pregnant again. This time it was twins, 2 boys they named Michael and Mason, and the ranch house truly became filled with the noise and chaos Eleanor had once dreamed about. Marcus was a devoted father, patient and loving with the children in a way that showed he had healed from the loss of his first child. He taught Matthew to ride before the boy was old enough to go to school, and read to Emma from his treasured book of Walt Whitman poems, even though she was too young to understand the words. The years passed in a blur of work and love and family. Matthew grew tall and strong, with his father's way with horses and his mother's head for business. Emma proved to be artistic, filling the house with drawings and later paintings that captured the beauty of the Nevada landscape. The twins were wild and adventurous, always getting into trouble and keeping Eleanor and Marcus on their toes. Pete retired when Matthew was 10, handing over the foreman duties to one of the men Marcus had trained. The old cowboy built a small house on the edge of the ranch property and spent his remaining years fishing and telling stories to anyone who would listen. He passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, and the whole community turned out for his funeral. Eleanor's biggest triumph came when she was 35, 15 years after her father's death. The same bank that had tried to force her out held a ceremony honoring the most successful businesses in the region, and the Dixon Ranch was recognized as the top operation in 3 counties. Eleanor stood on the stage with Marcus beside her and accepted the award while thinking about Cyrus Whitmore, who had retired in disgrace several years earlier after being caught embezzling from the bank. But the award meant less to her than the life she had built. She looked out at the crowd and saw her children sitting in the front row, saw the ranch hands who had become like family, saw the community that had eventually come to respect what she had accomplished. And most of all, she felt Marcus's hand in hers, steady and strong, and knew that this was what mattered. That evening, after the ceremony, they sat on the porch as they had done countless times over the years. The children were inside getting ready for bed, and the ranch was quiet except for the usual sounds of horses and cattle settling for the night. "Do you ever think about that first year?" Eleanor asked, leaning her head on Marcus's shoulder. "How hard it was, how close we came to losing everything." "All the time," Marcus said. "I think about the woman who was brave enough to keep fighting when everyone told her she couldn't. I think about how lucky I was to find her when I needed her most." "I needed you too," Eleanor said. "I was drowning, and you threw me a lifeline even though you were barely keeping your own head above water." "We saved each other," Marcus said simply. "That's what love does. It gives you a reason to keep going even when you think you can't take another step." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars come out over the desert. Eleanor thought about her father, about how proud he would be of what she had built, of the family she had created. She thought about Sarah, the woman she had never met but whose loss had shaped the man Eleanor loved. She thought about all the choices and chances and moments of grace that had brought her to this place, to this life that was better than anything she could have imagined in those dark days after her father's death. "I love you," she said, the words as true and necessary as they had been the first time she spoke them. "I love you too," Marcus replied, pulling her closer. "Every day more than the day before." The years continued to pass, bringing more changes and challenges. Matthew married a schoolteacher from town and started his own horse training operation on a piece of land Marcus and Eleanor gave him as a wedding present. Emma moved to San Francisco to study art, but she came home every summer and filled the house with her vibrant energy. The twins eventually settled down, one becoming a veterinarian and the other taking over the cattle operation on the main ranch. Eleanor and Marcus grew older together, their hair turning gray and their faces lining with age, but their love never wavered. They were partners still, working side by side even as they gradually handed over more responsibility to their children and grandchildren. The ranch continued to thrive, now into its third generation, a testament to the vision Eleanor and her father had shared, and the determination she and Marcus had used to make it a reality. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party that brought together people from all over the state. There were speeches and toasts, and enough food to feed an army, but the moment Eleanor treasured most was when Marcus stood up and asked for everyone's attention. He was not a man comfortable with public speaking, and Eleanor could see the effort it cost him to stand before the crowd. But when he started talking, his voice was steady and clear. 30 years ago, I was a broken man who had given up on finding happiness again, he said. I had stopped talking because I didn't think I had anything worth saying anymore. But then, I met a woman who showed me that words matter when they're used to build people up instead of tear them down, to offer comfort instead of causing pain. Eleanor gave me back my voice, and in return, I gave her my heart. It was the best trade I ever made. The crowd laughed and applauded, but Marcus wasn't finished. He turned to Eleanor, his gray-green eyes still as clear and focused as they had been the day they met. "You are the love of my life," he said. "You are the reason I wake up grateful every morning and go to sleep content every night. You are the mother of my children and the partner of my dreams and the best friend I have ever had. And if I had to do it all over again, I wouldn't change a single moment, because every one of them led me to you." Eleanor was crying openly now, and she stood and crossed to Marcus, kissing him in front of their children and grandchildren and friends while everyone cheered. They had been through so much together, had built something lasting and beautiful from the ashes of their grief and loss, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would love this man until her dying breath and beyond. The party went on late into the night, but eventually the guests departed and the family went to bed, and Eleanor and Marcus found themselves back on the porch where they had spent so many evenings over the years. The ranch was quiet in the moonlight, peaceful and prosperous, and exactly what they had dreamed it would be. "You have any regrets?" Eleanor asked, taking Marcus's hand in hers. Marcus thought for a moment, then shook his head. "Not a single one. This life we built, this family we created, it's more than I ever thought I deserved. Sarah would have been happy for me, I think. She would have liked you." "I wish I could have known her," Eleanor said. "She must have been remarkable to have been loved by you." "She was," Marcus agreed. "But you're remarkable too, in your own way. Different, but just as special. I've been blessed to love two extraordinary women in my life, and that's more than most men can say." They sat together until the moon set, and the sky began to lighten with the approach of dawn. 30 years had passed since that day in the alley when Marcus had found Eleanor crying and had broken his long silence to comfort her. 30 years of love and work and building a life together. And as they watched the sun rise over the ranch they had poured their hearts into, Eleanor knew that every moment had been worth it. Their story was not one of dramatic rescues or grand gestures. It was a story of two wounded people who had found each other at exactly the right moment, who had chosen to take a chance on love even when they were scared, who had worked together to build something that would outlast them both. It was a story of partnership and respect, and the kind of deep, abiding love that only comes from truly knowing another person and choosing them every single day. As Eleanor and Marcus entered their golden years, they became fixtures in the community, respected elders, whose advice was sought on everything from ranching to relationships. They watched their grandchildren grow, and their great-grandchildren be born, and they took pride in knowing that the legacy they left would be measured not just in acres and cattle and horses, but in the values they had passed down through the generations. Marcus never lost his preference for quiet, but he spoke freely with his family, his words still carefully chosen but offered with love and wisdom. He taught his grandchildren the same patience with animals that he had learned over a lifetime, and he read to them from his worn copy of Walt Whitman, the pages now fragile with age, but the words still powerful. Eleanor remained sharp and capable into her 70s, still keeping an eye on the ranch finances, and occasionally riding out to check on the herd when the mood struck her. She wrote down the story of the ranch for her children and grandchildren, preserving the history of how it had almost been lost, and how she and Marcus had saved it together. It became a cherished family document, passed down through the generations as a reminder of what love and determination could accomplish. They celebrated their 40th anniversary, then their 50th, milestones that seemed almost miraculous given how close they had each come to giving up on happiness. Each anniversary was marked with quiet celebration, just the two of them on the porch where they had spent so many hours over the years, talking about the life they had built and the love that had sustained them through it all. When Marcus was 74, he suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed on his right side. It was a devastating blow for a man who had spent his life working with his hands, but Eleanor was there every step of the way through his recovery. She helped him relearn basic tasks, encouraged him when he grew frustrated, and reminded him every day that his worth was not measured in what he could do but in who he was. The recovery was slow and incomplete, but Marcus adapted with the same quiet determination that had always characterized him. He could no longer train horses himself, but he supervised the younger trainers and passed on his knowledge. And he still sat on the porch with Eleanor every evening, his left hand clasped in both of hers, watching the sun set over the land they loved. Eleanor's health began to decline when she was 76, a slow fading that the doctors attributed to a weak heart. She accepted it with the same grace she had shown throughout her life, more concerned about making sure Marcus would be taken care of than about her own mortality. Their children promised they would look after him, and Eleanor made them swear that the ranch would stay in the family, that all the work she and Marcus had done would not be undone. On a warm spring evening when Eleanor was 78 and Marcus was 79, they sat together on the porch one last time. Eleanor was tired, more tired than she had ever been, and she knew in her bones that her time was coming to an end. But she was not afraid. She had lived a full and beautiful life, had loved deeply and been loved in return, and she was ready for whatever came next. "Thank you," she said to Marcus, her voice barely above a whisper, "for everything. For saving the ranch, for giving me a family, for loving me even when I was difficult and stubborn and impossible." "You were never impossible," Marcus said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "You were perfect exactly as you were. You saved me, Eleanor. You gave me a reason to live again when I thought I was done. You gave me 30 years of happiness I never thought I'd have. I'm the one who should be thanking you." "We saved each other," Eleanor said, echoing the words Marcus had spoken so many years ago. "That's what love does." She closed her eyes, still holding Marcus's hand, and took her last breath with a smile on her face. Marcus sat with her as the stars came out, holding her hand and crying silently, grieving the loss of the woman who had been his partner, his love, his reason for being for half his life. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, a testament to the impact Eleanor had made on her community, and the respect she had earned over the course of her long life. Her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren all spoke about her strength, her kindness, her unwavering determination to build a better life for her family. And Marcus sat in the front row, his heart broken but grateful for every moment he had been given with her. He lived for 2 more years after Eleanor's death, growing frailer but never losing his clarity of mind. He spent his days with his children and grandchildren, passing on stories and wisdom, and making sure they understood the legacy Eleanor had left. And every evening, he sat on the porch alone, looking out at the ranch they had built together, talking to Eleanor as if she were still beside him. When Marcus passed away quietly in his sleep at the age of 81, the family buried him next to Eleanor on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a pair of oak trees they had planted together 40 years earlier. The headstones were simple, just their names and the years of their lives, but the children added an inscription that captured the essence of their love story. Together they built a legacy. Together they rest. The Dixon Ranch continued to thrive for generations, each new steward adding their own chapter to the story, while honoring the foundation that Eleanor and Marcus had laid. The main house was preserved as it had been, with the porch where they had spent so many evenings together becoming a sacred space where family members went to think and remember and feel connected to the 2 people who had started it all. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun was setting over the Nevada desert and the stars were just beginning to appear, ranch hands would swear they could see 2 figures sitting on that porch, side by side, holding hands and watching over the land they loved. Whether it was memory or imagination or something more, it brought comfort to know that the love Eleanor Dixon and Marcus Miller had shared was still present, still a living force in the place they had built together. Their story became legend in McGill and the surrounding towns, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. But at its heart, it remained a simple truth. Two broken people had found each other when they needed it most, had chosen love over fear, and had built something that would last long after they were gone. It was a story of second chances and quiet heroism, of the power of words spoken at the right moment, and the strength that comes from true partnership. And it all began on a dusty Nevada ranch in 1882, when a cowboy who had not spoken more than 10 words all year broke his silence to comfort a woman who needed to hear that she was not alone, that she was stronger than she knew, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is keep fighting for what you love. From that moment of connection grew a love that would span decades, build an empire, and create a family that would carry forward the values of determination, compassion, and the belief that with the right person beside you, anything is possible.